Hey guys, Mr. Klein here. Once again, with Causes of the Civil War, this is part three. So if you've not watched part one or two, make sure you go back and watch that first before you watch this one. It's pretty important with what we're talking about coming up through here, because a lot of things are going to reoccur that we've kind of already mentioned before in part one or part two. So this is Causes of the Civil War. So the other parts I've been really mentioning, the lead up to the Civil War, what was going on that led to the South finally seceding or leaving the Union of the United States, becoming the Confederate States of America. So we talked a lot about laws that came through. The idea of popular sovereignty was something else that we've also talked about, and where people should be the ones that decide if they're going to be a free territory or a slave territory. A lot of this led to violence. The last part we talked about was John Brown, the Pottawatomie Massacre of led in Kansas, which is like a mini civil war that happened there. We have the rise of the Republicans with Abraham Lincoln debating Stephen Douglas, who's a Democrat, on the issue of slavery. Stephen Douglas debates Lincoln, and they kind of go back and forth. Lincoln wants to stop the spread of slavery. Believes that United States citizens, as well as African Americans, deserve all national rights that they have. Stephen Douglas disagrees with that and believes that public sovereignty should be the decision of the government to stop slavery. And so that's kind of where we are now. What we're going to be talking about is eventually to the very first battle of the Civil War, which is for something that's going to be our last little part there. But how do we get there? So here's our boy again, John Brown. Sorry, where my face is kind of blocks the title, but John Brown is at it again. That's what we're talking about here. So this is a raid on Harper's Ferry. So John Brown, remember, he wants to fight violence with violence. He's one that was part of the Pottawatomie Massacre, drags 5 people that are pro-slavery out of their houses, kills them with swords, leads to the Bleeding Kansas, the mini Civil War there. He's known as the first terrorist of the United States, and you can see why. So his next big idea is to raid Harper's Ferry, which you can see there in the picture. Is part of Virginia at this time. West Virginia becomes its own state during the Civil War, which we will talk about way later on. We'll talk about the Civil War itself there. But Harper's Ferry is an arsenal in Virginia, and he leads a small group to raid it. And the idea is, if you have an arsenal, you have weapons and guns that you can steal. And his main idea was to start a slave revolt in Virginia. So give all these African Americans weapons, fight against the slave masters, and lead a revolt and gain their freedom there. So his big plan was he's going to take the small group in there. He got the word out to all the African Americans in Virginia that he could, to say, hey, come to Harper's Ferry at night. We're going to raid it. We're going to take all this, all these weapons, and we're going to give them to you, and you can lead a revolt and free all the people that are on the plantations that you have there. So he does that, gets that word out, tries to tell everyone that's what's going on, but no slaves come to raid the arsenal. They decide not to do it. And so instead of backing down and regrouping, John Brown's like, the heck with it, we're going to do it anyway. And so they raid Harper's Ferry, and it's bad. A lot of John Brown's men die due to this. It's an arsenal, so guess what? It's going to be got a lot of military people there that know how to use them, right? And so they try to go against them there. Brown is actually arrested by Robert E. Lee. So if you don't know who Robert E. Lee is, he's most famous for being the head general for the Confederate Army. But before this, he was part of the United States Army. And that's something to kind of remember here, is that a lot of people that are these military generals and stuff that fight for the Confederacy are actually part of the United States Army or military at this time. So it's kind of a weird thing to kind of think about there. But Brown is arrested by Robert E. Lee. He is tried in court and found guilty of murder and treason because he murdered people. And then treason, which is a word that is pretty important to understand, which means attacking or going against your government. And at this time, he's raiding were trying to raid a U.S. military armory, and um, that's a crime. You can't do that. That is treason. You're trying to overthrow the government in some way by going against the military there. And so John Brown is arrested. He's tried in court. He's found guilty, and he is sentenced to die by hanging. So John Brown is a pretty fascinating character to kind of think about and listen to and understand what he's going to think about. He believes that God is the one commanding him to do these things. He's a very strong abolitionist, which means getting rid of slavery, but he does it through violence instead of going through political means. And that's something that is kind of, we think about, abolition, slavery is bad. It's all these kind of things, but was violence the right way to do those things, right? And that's always kind of a thing that's unique about John Brown. Some hail him as a hero. He's doing all these great things. He's, doing all these amazing things that are going on, but also a lot of people see him as a terrorist, right? Attacking U.S. things, killing people, dragging them out without giving them proper trial, and those kind of things there, right? And so John Brown is a very unique person to kind of study and all those kind of things there. I was trying to suggest you kind of go look at some of the stuff that he kind of did and kind of his idea of what you should do to get rid of slavery here. But Raid on Harper's Ferry upsets a lot of people, saying, look what people are trying to do, instead of going through these routes, or using violence instead. Then we get to the big thing when we talk about causes of the Civil War. This event right here really changes how the South used the Union of the United States, right? The representative government in Washington, D.C. So we get to the election of 1860. So this is a pretty important one to talk about, because honestly, it was really, the Democrats' fault of, why they lost, and we'll talk why that is here in a second. So we have our stage here. We have 4 candidates that run for the presidency. Sorry, and Abraham Lincoln. He runs as the Republican candidate during this time. So he is against the spread of slavery. Remember that we talked about that in part 2 with the Lincoln and Stephen Douglas debates and the rise of republicanism, those kind of things. The Democrats really hurt themselves when they were having their nominating conventions. They were very upset. There were Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. They cannot choose a candidate to run for president. So what they decide is to split. They break away. So you have Northern Democrats and you have Southern Democrats. Stephen A. Douglas, if you remember him, he's the one that debated Abraham Lincoln. Maybe go back to part 2 of our Causes of Civil War. Debates Abraham Lincoln over this idea of popular sovereignty. He is the Northern Democrat. So the convention that happens for them, he is the Northern Democrat. The other one is John C. Breckinridge, which, if you don't know him, he is from Kentucky. He was vice president under James Buchanan. He is one of the youngest vice presidents ever. I think he was in his mid-30s. And he was actually helped Stephen Douglas with popular sovereignty and all that kind of stuff. They're believing that same idea, but Southern Democrats get him as the candidate. So we have 3 candidates already. We have a Republican candidate, Lincoln. We have 2 Democratic candidates there. And also, we have a guy named John Bell, who runs as the part of the Constitution and Union Party. And really all that is these, if you remember, we talked about the Republicans in part 2, are come out of the old Whig Party there. So a lot of the people that were conservative Whig members, so the people that are against, aren't as liberal or changing things, they create this party called the Constitution and Union Party, and what they believe in is that to stop the South from seceding, which means leaving the Union, and trying to work things out that way. So John Bell runs as that, and you can see that on our graph, the map that's right below me, that John Bell wins quite a three states there. Douglas only wins one, which is Missouri. Breckinridge wins quite a few in the South because remember he's the Southern Democrat, and then Lincoln wins quite a bit. You notice over there in the West you have California and Oregon. So those are two new states that we haven't really talked about before. Texas is here as well, and so really important to kind of understand what was going on there. So because of this split that happens, Lincoln wins overwhelming support. If you look at our chart down here with electoral votes, Lincoln wins 180, and then second place was Breckinridge with 72. Douglas only comes in with 12. And so that's a pretty big thing. Abraham Lincoln wins 39, almost 40% of the popular vote, versus Stephen A. Douglas, who won 29%. So Stephen A. Douglas was a popular candidate, but he was a Northern Democrat. All your Southern Democrats are going to vote for Breckinridge. In the North, it's more of a Republican area at this time because, if you remember, all these people were abolitionists and against slavery. So Lincoln really wins all those the states in the North there. So this right here, the reason why this is so important is that this makes the southern states, or the people that live in the South, that, you know what, the North has too much power now. There's no way that we're going to be able to stop the federal government from banning slavery in these new territories. So if you look at our map up here, all this gray, those are territories, right? So are they going to be free states or are they going to be slave states? And so that's something that they're kind of debating at this time. They feel like that their voice is not being heard, and they're kind of fed up with it. If you go back to part 2, when we talk about the Lincoln and Douglas debates, Douglas says if the Republicans gain power, that the South and North are going to go to war. And this is exactly what he was, looking at what was going to happen. So Lincoln wins. He's a Republican. He's against the spread of slavery. And now you have the Southerners feeling that there's no way that they're going to have any power in the government at all. And so their idea of their way of life, which is agriculture using slave labor, was in jeopardy for the South. So you see them really trying to break away right after this. And so this election in 1860 is kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back, and we start to see the states in the South start to fall away from the Union. And that's where we get to secession, right? Or secede, which means withdrawing or leaving. And so that's what we're going to talk about here. So that's where we started happening in 1860, like literally a month after the elections happened. You have the South threatening to leave. And so the first state to leave the United States, the Union of the United States, is South Carolina. They leave in December of 1860. So right after the election of Abraham Lincoln, they decide they're going to leave the United States. So a lot of people were kind of waiting for the first one to happen. All these southern states are kind of sitting there waiting, to see what was going on. And then South Carolina decides to pull the trigger on that, and they leave right after the election. John Crittenden, who's another representative from Kentucky, he tries to one last time re-establish the Missouri Compromise line, and trying to make it to where there's a compromise of we're still going to have slave states, we're still going to have free states, and we're going to keep this line that way everyone on both sides can have what they want. But at this point, nothing was going to happen. The southern states were already fed up. They felt like there was no way that they could really have their say in anything. So February of 1861 rolls around. So the South Carolina's been out of the Union for a couple months, and now we have a whole bunch more southern states decide to leave the Union. So you have Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, and Georgia all decide to secede. So if you look at our map there, all that dark blue, those are the ones that decide to leave the United States. And so that's a big chunk of the South. And you see those ones in gray: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. They all eventually leave as well. But they do not leave until our last cause of the Civil War, which actually starts the Civil War, which is Fort Sumter. They decide to leave after that. So you have these initial 7 states that come together and decide, what are we going to do now? So they all left. So what are we going to do here? So they decide to form their own country called the Confederate States of America. And so what that is that they decide to create a confederacy. So if you remember, we talk about the very first Constitution of the United States, which is the Articles of Confederation. We were a confederacy during that time. What that is that states had the majority of the power, and the national government is very small and weak. It does not have a lot of power, which is what the southern states wanted. Remember, they were wanting the states to be able to decide free states versus slave states, that kind of stuff there, not the federal government. So in a confederacy, the federal government is very weak, and the states have majority of the power. They have more say in the national government, that kind of stuff. So they decided to create a confederacy, and they do that in the February of the same year. So as soon as they decide to split, they create the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis is selected to serve as the president for a 6-year term. So in their Constitution, the president serves for 6 years. Jefferson Davis is actually from Kentucky. If you go to Todd County, if you live in Kentucky, you know what this is. You go west into Todd County, there's a monument for Jefferson Davis there. It kind of looks like the Washington Monument, but to signify Jefferson Davis as being one of the presidents of the Confederacy there. So now we have the Confederacy officially a country. So we have 2 countries in what used to be the United States, which is kind of crazy to look at. These pictures right here kind of show are pretty interesting to me. I think they kind of show kind of the mindset of a lot of what was going on here. The picture on the right is a picture from Lincoln's inauguration. So that's when he becomes president of the United States. A lot of people there, packed jam tight there at the Capitol in Washington D.C. Jefferson Davis's inauguration is on the left. Not as well attended there as well. I think that just gives a good idea of a lot of people weren't sure about this. They understood what was going on, but they weren't sure what was the end result going to be with this. And so when these states secede, they have to scramble to create a government, because now you have to have a government right away. They're scrambling to get a military. So they're taking over these bases that are in the South that are U.S. bases, but now they are Confederate bases, or they're trying to be. You have to recruit people from that were United States troops. Now they're Confederate troops. So it's a lot of stuff they had to do, a lot of scrambling going on, and it's for the Confederacy to survive. There's going to be a gigantic uphill battle for them to do that. The United States already has established things, that kind of stuff, and you'll learn more about the differences between the North and the South and the advantages the North had over the South, all those kind of things. I think this picture kind of shows what was going on here, right? Is that you have a new government scrambled together in a month's time versus one that's been going on for about 100 years now. And so that's a pretty interesting thing to kind of look at there. All right, our last cause of the Civil War, which is the start of the Civil War, is the attack on Fort Sumter. This happens in 1861. This is the official beginning of the Civil War. So what happens here during this time? So Confederate troops are trying to take over this base. It's an island. You can look at our the map here. This is Fort Sumner is a federal base, which means it's part of the United States. But you notice all around here, all this red is Confederate. So Fort Sumner is kind of there by itself, surrounded by all these Confederate bases and that kind of stuff there. So what the Confederate troops decide to do is they start shelling the Fort Sumner, trying to bombard them constantly with firing artillery to get them to kind of surrender this fort to the Confederacy. They're trying to get them to get out. That way they can have it, because it's pretty strategic there. Because look here on the map, this is a harbor. Supplies, things like that, go into this area. So it's a pretty important thing to have. If the Union has it, they can block things. But if the Confederacy have it, they can start getting the supplies that they need throughout there. So Fort Sumner is in South Carolina. So it's pretty important to understand. South Carolina's first state to secede from the Union. This is where it takes up. Instead of giving up the fort, Lincoln decides to send in ships to give supplies to the fort to stand up against the Confederacy. So that's a pretty important thing to kind of understand here, that Lincoln does not back down on this. But on April 12th, 1861, Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumner, physically attacking them. The artillery before that is just trying to get them out, so just shells and that kind of stuff. They're actually firing upon the fort at this time. After about 34 hours of constant firing like this, the Union decides to surrender the fort, and it goes to the Confederacy. And this is the official beginning of the Civil War. There's an attack of Confederacy against the Union. Lincoln doesn't back down, kind of fights against them, pushes back, and now the Civil War has officially begun. And this quote right here from Lincoln, it says, "The last ray of hope for preserving the Union has expired at the assault upon Fort Sumner." Right? So all this idea of trying to bring the Union back together is gone, because now the attack happens on Fort Sumner. Now the Union has to fight the Confederacy there. So that is the official end of the causes of the Civil War. So some really interesting things going on there, kind of talking about the lead up. Big thing from this is the election of 1860, where Abraham Lincoln becomes president. Not even a month after he is elected to be president of the United States, South Carolina decides to secede or leave the Union of the United States. And then 2 months later in February, you have 6 other states decide to leave. And then you have them create the Confederate States of America. So there are 2 countries now, where there used to be 1. And yeah, so now we have the start of the Civil War, and it lasts longer than people thought it was going to last. A lot of people thought the Union was going to squash this idea of Confederacy pretty quickly. It does not. It lasts for about 4 years, and we're entrenched, people fighting each other. It's pretty crazy to think about. All the people that are brothers and family that fight each other, all that kind of stuff here. So this is now at the point where we are trying to preserve the Union, and we're trying to make sure that we can bring them back together. And what are we going to do, right? We are 100 years into our country, and this is the first big test for the country. What are we going to do when people do not agree with what's going on? How do we change that? What's going to happen? And so now we get to the Civil War. Right? We're going to have to fight each other. Are we going to be able to bring it back together, or we're going to have 2 separate countries and trying to fight for land and the idea of citizenship and slavery through all these territories? And so it's really interesting kind of talk about all that stuff there. All right. So like I said, if you haven't watched part 2 or part 1, I don't know why you're here at part 3. You're at the very end now. But go back and watch those, kind of understand what's going on leading up to the attack on Fort Sumter. All right, guys. I'll see y'all later.